Up to this point, all of you have been left in the dark in reference to the true history of Kempo and the history of its founder, James Matosi. And that information you generally did have about its history and James Matosi was generally distorted and out of focus. I will guarantee that will be on these videotapes, 95% you have never heard. The other 5% you've heard has been distorted or not true whatsoever. Once again then, this video will be the second in a series of 3 entitled The Heritage of James Matosi, the true founder of the system we call Kempo. I'm now Tracy. Most of you have never been my personal students, nor have you been to one of my seminars. Therefore, let me prepare you for what you're going to see on these series of tapes. Eventually, the entire series will cover, first of all, the history of China as relates to the martial arts. The series we're now recording, the heritage of James Matosi, and then the history of modern Kempo. Each of these will overlap. So as I get into this series, it's my intention that rather than just answering a question, rather than just making a statement, I give you the background and history so you understand why these things happen, so you're not just taking yes, no, my word for it. You can go back eventually, do the same research that I have done from the same sources of history. The one thing that I hate in this world is that we are lied to continuously. We're lied to by the government. We're lied to those people around us. And most of us, almost every article that you see in the martial arts magazines is a fabrication and contains lies. So what you have to do then is to put yourself in a position where from educated standpoint, not just your own, but from historians, you can understand exactly what happened. It isn't just enough that I tell you that James Matosi was the founder of Kempo, that his ancestors brought it over from China. Big deal. It means absolutely nothing to you. What I intend to do is to go all the way back in history. I know I was the same way in school, high school in particular. I hated history. Who cared if Napoleon got defeated at Waterloo? Who cared if Hannibal took his elephants over the Alps? Who was Caesar? What does it have to do with me today? That is why the history of James Matosi is so important today. Because for the first time in our generations, the United States is not the ultimate power in the world. And notice, the history of the world is changing on a daily basis. 2 years ago, the boogeyman, the great threat, communism, Russia, is all that anyone cared about. Russia, as we know it, is a thing of the past. Yet look what happens in every country. In Russia, Gorbachev completely changes history, gives all of Russia its freedom. That isn't enough. He gave them their freedom. Why doesn't he give them jobs? Why doesn't he give them food? They're not satisfied with this. They simply kick the man out. What you have to understand also is that the history of the world that we read in the books was always centered around, let me quote, the Christian white male. And to this day, that's exactly the problem we have. Particularly the people in power seem to think that God, in his infinite wisdom, gave the Christian white man right to rule the world. Notice I say white man, not female. Look at even in the United States today. The most powerful part of our Congress is the Senate. The division in the United States is 50-50 women. How many women sit on the United States Senate? In the Clarence Thomas case, how many females of the Senate sat on that hearing? It's very simple. There are not 50% You can count them on the hands, fingers of one hand. Also, approximately 14 to 15% of the United States is black. How many black senators do we have? You have to understand, we do not live in a democracy. We live in a republic, and that is different. The Pledge of Allegiance. And to the republic for which it stands, which means we elect representatives. We do not have a vote on anything. And once this power structure has been in place, there's nothing you can do about it. So what I'm trying to do then is that when I give you historical facts, it will not be just a date by itself. When I give you that date, it will mean something. I want history to come alive for you. Who is Buddha? Who cares? You've seen this fat little guy they have out there. Who's Confucius? You hear the jokes. Confucius say. What is this Tao, the Tao of Jatgundo? What is the Wei? What is Shinto? By the time you're done with this videotape, I guarantee that you will know more than 99% of the experts out there in the martial arts. And more important, you will understand why it's important, not just to the martial arts we're a part of, but the entire world today. What our Christian white world cannot ever understand is how the Oriental mind works. Remember, in the history and scheme of things, the Christian white man has really only been in power for 400 years, and that is a limited section. He has never completely controlled all of Russia, certainly not China with 1 billion people. In the Orient, we've had our own little sphere. The entire Second World War would be fought over the fact we did not understand the Oriental mind, and we completely misjudged their capability. Do I have to now bring it to you today? Without firing one shot, the Japanese people have accomplished more in gaining control of this world and their sphere of empire than they ever did during the Second World War. And we have sat there and let it happen. So what do we do now? Blame the Japanese for everything. This is 1992 for a historical perspective. The Japanese are the cause of everything. If we could only get the Japanese to lower their trade barriers, all the problems of the United States would be solved. Let's look at it. Did the Japanese cause the saving and loan bank failure where it will cost us $1.5 trillion? As an interesting point of history, in the last 6 years, more money was stolen by white-collar workers to the tune of what's going to cost us $1.5 trillion. This was stolen by every thief in every country in the history of the world. Yet how many of these men have gone to jail? The same thing, every year, the test scores at every level, from grade school, high school, and college, are lower. We are polluting our air. We're polluting the water we drink. We're becoming a second-class nation as far as a power in the world economically. So what's the problem? Of course, the Japanese. No, the problem lies at home. As we get into the development of the history of James Potosi, you'll understand why the Japanese do this. What we have in the martial arts isn't so much that there's really a difference between the Chinese systems, the Japanese systems, and the Korean systems. The real difference is in the cultures of the different people. Since we are studying a martial art that came out of the Orient, you must understand the roots. What more people want than anything else, where did I as a person come from? Who's my father, my grandfather? Most of us, unfortunately, can't go back more than 2 to 3 or 4 generations. And a poor black who was brought here on a slave ship knows even less. Every adopted child wants to know who were their real parents. What most martial artists don't understand out there, particularly in Kempo, Americans do not want American Kempo. You've got that in boxing, you've got this. What people want, where did his heritage come from? And the more you cut the roots from the martial arts, the less appeal you have to people. Someone doesn't want to know, where did you, oh, I made it up, it's a combination of everything. Yeah, no one wants that. What I'm going to do now is to give you a couple of illustrations of what I'm talking about. I can just show you two pictures. You're going to take a look at a picture. One is of a winter scene. The other is of an American flag. Big deal. What I'm going to do is cut into those pictures. Then I'll come back. And when you understand the history of each of those pictures, you'll understand how important history will become as we develop the legacy of James Matosi. The first picture you're seeing is simply a postcard. It's a Christmas scene. Very nice, you know, snow, trees, landscape. You've seen pictures like this a million times. What makes it any different than anyone else? Until you understand, the person that painted this is handicapped. They have no arms. The paintbrush was placed between this person's toes, and that person painted that entire photograph. That is an actual painting. Imagine what this person had to go through to train themselves. When you take a look at it now, it's certainly a lot different than just simply sitting there and looking at another card that someone sent out at Christmas time. The next photograph that you're looking at is a picture taken at our school in San Jose, California, ran by Ted Sumner and Mary Basic. Big deal. You see a group there. You see a large American flag. When I came in, I don't know, the flag, it's huge. It's just a little bit dirty and there's a tear at one end. And you wonder, why is this flag in this studio? Once you understand the history of that flag, there's an entire world that's open to you. The photograph that you're looking at is a picture of myself and Ted Sumner in front of that same flag at the studio in San Jose, California. This is really Ted Sumner's story, but I'll be telling you. The flag that you're looking at flew over the American Army headquarters on Corregidor, on Bataan, in the Philippines during the Second World War. The Japanese had just invaded the Philippines, and it's very obvious they would not be able to hold out for very much longer. General MacArthur had been persuaded, rather than give his life on that remote island, to take command of the entire Pacific operation. And as such, he then turned the command over to General Wainwright. Wainwright was then given one more star on his shoulder, which would then enable him, and the Japanese knew it, to surrender all of the forces. The order was then given that they would surrender the American forces, and along with it, the headquarters and the flag. His grandfather, a member of the engineer, and several other members refused to surrender, knowing that if they did, that American flag would be desecrated. That is the only thing American that still stood in that part of the world for thousands of miles now. Remember, Pearl Harbor had already been bombed. The Japanese had taken over Java. Singapore had surrendered with 90,000 men. His grandfather then joined with the faithful Filipinos, and for 4 years they became guerrilla fighters, all the time taking that American flag with them, protecting it to make sure it was not desecrated nor destroyed. At the end of the Second World War, when the Philippines was finally liberated, his grandfather and those that remained of the engineer crew would take this flag back to the United States. When Ted's grandfather died, he was buried at Arlington Cemetery under full military conditions, and this flag that you're looking at was draped over his coffin. And at the end of that funeral, President Dwight D. Eisenhower personally presented this flag to his grandmother. Now when you look at that flag, it doesn't matter that it's a little bit dirty, it's a little bit soiled, and that one end is ripped. On the other hand, you can see why a Japanese flag will never fly next to that flag in that studio. This is what I'm talking about. What I will try to do as I present the history. It isn't going to just be a name and a date. You're going to remember who each of these people are. And more than that, why were they important? And why is a heritage of James Matosi one of the most outstanding in all of the martial arts? It isn't just enough that I tell you who James Matosi was, but I have to take you back on a trip in history that's going to go back 2,500 years. So you'll understand the true depth and the heritage, not only of the system we call Kempo, but of all the martial arts. I'm Al Tracy, and I've spent over 35 years researching the history of Kempo. I've had 4 things on my side that most people don't that allow me to do this. First, I have the time, I had the money. I have the college educational background, and I had the desire. What you're looking at is just part of the research library I have. When I research an article, I do not go to the public library. I go out and buy the books. In addition to this, in this corner, just part of it, I have probably the most complete collection of all the martial arts magazines since the original inception of the first Black Belt magazine. It's of interest to note that of these magazines that go back for almost 28 years, only 3 had historical accurate enough records that they could be used. But one thing that you'll learn as you get into the martial arts, you have been lied to from the very beginning, from its very origin to its modern inception. And what I'm going to do then is to take you step by step through each of these. What you see in the background also, each of these pictures, when you're done, right now mean absolutely nothing to you. But when you're done, you will intimately know what each of these pictures represent and how it ties in to the martial arts and the system that we call Kempo. One of the greatest problems we all have, although we're teaching a martial arts that has its origin in the Orient, almost all of us come from a Christian Judaic background. And because of this, many things we see seem foreign to us. What I have to ask you to do then, I don't care what your religious beliefs are. It is not my intention then to challenge any of these. But what you have to do to understand the martial arts completely is to see the world through their eyes. The television set that you are watching this on, the VCR that's being played on, is made in Japan. Probably the car that you drive was manufactured in Japan, and surely the Sony CD that you're listening there was definitely made in Japan. Why did General Motors just announce the fact that they are going to have to lay off another 75,000 American workers? It's very simple. We do not understand the Japanese, or more particularly the Oriental mind. Also, we have always set ourselves up that somehow God gave us the right to be the policeman of the world, to set the moral standards. And that's exactly what has happened in this country. since the days of slavery, when God in his infinite wisdom gave the Christian white man the infinite knowledge to take care of these black children. It's the same thing the rest of the world. 1 billion Chinese. And for years, the United States would not recognize they existed. The same thing is true in the Middle East. Why do you think we're having so much trouble in the Middle East? Perhaps we'd better go back and look at a little bit of history. Until 1947, there was no Israel. And it's always been throughout history that the strong always take advantage of the weak. So in 1947, the United Nations then took away land that belonged to the Arab world and gave it to the Jews for their homeland, with the claim they had been there 2,000 years before. And you wonder to this day why the Arab people are unhappy with what's happening in Israel. How do you think we in the United States would feel if suddenly the United Nations declared that we're going to give back to the American Indian or the Native Americans, Michigan, Wisconsin, and right on down the line? The same thing is true that when we look at the wars we've had, we've never understood how the mind of the Oriental works. And the only one that really understood this was General MacArthur. This was during the Second World War. When it comes to history, when it comes to its own people, even the United States, there's something you have to understand. All governments lie. Let's take the Second World War as an example. I have to put things in perspective. At the beginning of the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur was a 5-star general. Before this time, he had a young aide who was only a major when he was a 5-star general. That was Dwight D. Eisenhower. MacArthur was then left in the Philippines, overran, knew his situation was desperate, but the United States government, from the president down, all assured him that forces were on the way, they would be liberated, that there was a task force bringing supplies and new men. They lied. They had never intended to let any of those people from there be rescued from the Philippines. And as General MacArthur would describe Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man would never tell the truth if a lie would suffice. And their reckoning was that if they actually told these Americans a fate, that they were going to end up, most of them dying on the Bataan Death March, or spending the rest of their career in Japanese camps, they would not have fought as bravely as they did. In his own words, General MacArthur pointed out he was much more in tune to the fighting spirit of Bushido than he was with the commands that were coming in from Washington, D.C., and he had every intent that he and his entire family would die before he left the Philippines. They finally persuaded him that he was more valuable to them alive as a commander than dead. What is quite interesting, the one man who had now moved up was on part of the chief of staff, the one general who wanted to leave him in the Philippines to die, was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also, to give you an idea of how, when it comes to the Oriental mind, we always, in the United States, have distorted. At the beginning of the Second World War, every Japanese American, for no cause whatsoever, was rounded up and be put in detention camps. Their business was confiscated, their lands, their homes, everything was confiscated from them. And now, at this point, 35 years later, they finally decided they would give each of the survivors, that's why they waited this long, very few of those survivors were here now, $20,000 in compensation. Americans, not one of them had ever been shown not to be loyal to the United States. On the other hand, Italy was our enemy. We were fighting the Axis from here. That was Mussolini in Italy. Those were the Nazis in Germany and Japan. Yet, because we have so many Italian people of descent in the United States, in 1942, while we were fighting Italy, they gave more to helping the civilians in Italy than they did to General MacArthur to fight the entire Second World War in 1942. Also, he understood the mind of the Orientals, the Japanese, so well that at the end of the war, all of the generals said, we never thought he would do what he did at every given stage of the war. He had the utmost respect for the bravery of the Japanese soldier. Like he pointed out, their bravery was the highest in the world. Their leadership was fine, and they had great material with which to fight the war. He understood the Japanese mentality. And the best way to beat the best fighter in the world is not let him fight. And the worst thing that the Japanese wanted, going all the way back, and you'll understand this more I get into it, the development of the samurai. You would die, but the worst thing to do was to die what they call a dog's death. And that's exactly what General MacArthur did during the war. The classic example of this was Rabaul. Rabaul was one of the most highly fortified of all the islands in the chain that would lead to Japan. Over 100,000 of the finest fighting troops that Japan had. Japan knew that each one of those would fight and die to the last man. So what did General MacArthur do? He came up to Rabaul, stepped, went around it, took the next island, and now cut off all the supplies to Rabaul. And 100,000 men either died of starvation or disease. They were never able to fight. They all died a dog's death. During the entire Second World War in Europe, it is estimated between the civilians, Russian, what happened, that over 30 million people died. The United States alone, in one famous battle in Italy, we lost 79,000 Americans. On the beaches of Normandy alone, we would lose 28,000 men. These are just in 2 battles. Yet during the entire Second World War, from the beginning of the inception, when General MacArthur took over, until the surrender of Japan, he lost a total of 27,000 American lives. He understood the mind of the Japanese. Let us go into history now to see the fatal mistakes that other presidents have made. Harry S. Truman, he could not even get Congress to declare war, therefore Korea became a police action. And remember, China had 1 billion people. We humiliated them in front of the rest of the world by refusing to even acknowledge they existed. We did not give them diplomatic recognition. Instead, we continued like we've always done to support a corrupt dictator. So what China did, and they did it to us twice, they brought us to our knees. The politics took over in Korea. MacArthur was a general. He knew exactly what it would take to win the war. No, they would not let him do it. The Chinese government then sent 1 million forces across the Yellow River, knowing we would not be able to bomb, first of all, the supplies or even the bridges. And for 2.5 years, they made a meat grinder out of the American forces there, and to a country that we would not even exist. For 2.5 years, they made us beg and plead until an armistice was signed, not against a war, simply to cease fire. We refused to acknowledge them. The worst thing that you can do with an Oriental is to make them lose face or not recognize them as equal. The next thing that would happen, to keep the world free for democracy, we get involved in Vietnam. And this time the Chinese communists made it even worse. They continued to supply and have all the necessary war equipment that the people, the Viet Congs, would ever need. This time we could not even sue for peace. We had to crawl out on our knees. And in Korea, we left 55,000 Americans dead, and Vietnam even more. And what did we learn? Nothing. So as we get into the development of history, we go back to the martial arts. Once again, what I want you to understand, forget what your political beliefs are. Forget what your religious beliefs are. The Orientals do not think as we do. They have different goals. They look at things differently. And that's exactly what we will do. As we will develop it, you will understand what is the difference between a Hindu. Who was Confucius? Why was he so important? Who were the Taoists? Who was Buddha? And more important, who and what is developed as Zen Buddhism? If you don't understand this, it would be the same as saying, without knowing it, oh, the Baptist preacher went out and performed a mass. No. Or the fact that you put all of these together. No, each of these is going to form a place in history. As you look at a lot of these different pictures that come from here, you're going to start to understand how these people think, why they think, why it is now that we are becoming a second-rate power in the world. Let me give you another illustration. We have a group of people in the United States that figure that we are the moral conscience of the world. And everyone in the world has to go by our dictates. At the present time, there are a few handful of people in the States that are very unhappy with what's happening in China. They call it human rights. Yet, this, for your date now, from here, is the 13th of January, 1992. It was just announced that in the war in the Middle East, our smart bombs were not so smart after all. They were the direct cause of 70,000 civilians being killed. And we talk about human right violations. The same thing we could justify during Vietnam. We could put napalm on women and children to keep the world free from communism. And you notice this has been the history of the United States. All that any country in the world ever had to do to get aid from us is to claim that they were freedom fighters against communism. Look back. What did 1 penny of foreign aid ever do for us? And we're doing the same thing today. You look at the Japanese mind. They sat there and let the United States put a man on the moon. We're talking about putting a man on Mars. We developed the biggest submarines in the world, the greatest aircraft carriers in the world, and suddenly we haven't got an enemy anymore. And not one bit of that technology we have is going to spill over to help the economy we have today. On the other hand, the Japanese have learned to work as a unit. The countries, the companies, the government, all the individuals have a common goal. In the United States, we do not. For years, it was very simple. What is good for General Motors is good for the United States. And I could not believe it. I just picked up the paper yesterday to show you how we're still honoring the dinosaurs. What do you think was given the award this year in the United States for our top company, the top product, the Cadillac Seville. Yes, the dinosaur. The Cadillac exemplifies everything the United States stood for. Huge fins on a car, a gas hog. When things get tough, lay off the workers and give the head of the company a raise. In Japan, it's exactly the opposite. If a company starts to have problems, it's very obvious the result is because of the president. The president of the company will resign and not fire the workers. So as we get into this development of history, we're going to go very back now. We have to understand what is the origin of the martial arts. But almost all of the martial arts, once again, I'm telling you, are tied into religion. Therefore, what I ask you to do, we say, is to forget what your own personal beliefs are. So you understand, I'm a Christian. But as such, I want you to understand, I have been able to sit back and see what these people see. You don't have to be Chinese to like Chinese food. So as we develop this, remember, this is a culture, these people that have been here for 2,000 years. How far can we trace our ancestry back? 200, 300, 400 years? Yet we consider them barbarians, and we are going to dictate. And the same thing is true as we get into the martial arts. At every phase of the line, we have been lied to. I went through college on speech and debate scholarships. And let me pass on just a little bit of the knowledge. Despite all of my college education, going to college means nothing. It's what you get out of it. I had the advantage when I went to college. I was able to take the courses I wanted. I had almost enough units in history alone, particularly in the Far East, Japan, China, to graduate. I took entire courses on simply the Second World War. But I want you to understand that, so you'll understand how people lie to you. The first is what is called arguing in a circle. Let me explain this. They come up with a premise. I'll give you a classic example. Why are the Koreans the greatest kickers in the world? This is arguing in a circle. As soon as you start arguing with this, you've automatically acknowledged the Koreans are the greatest kickers in the world. But who are the Koreans? The old men? The children? The trained athletes? Well, they'll make a statement. Since Wing Chun is the greatest fighting system in the world, let's find out why. No, you go back. What I ask all of you Christians, not to get offended now, play the devil's advocate with me on this one. So you'll understand what I'm talking about, arguing in a circle. What I'm talking about, if I can break any chain in that circle, the argument is invalid. Once again, Christians, play the devil's advocate. Go with me on this one. Is the Bible the Word of God? No matter if you answer yes or no, you've automatically acknowledged there is a God. The way to break this chain, if you will follow me, first of all, deny the existence of God. If there is no God, there is no Bible. If there is no Bible, there is no Jesus Christ. If there is no Jesus Christ, you go right down the line. On the other hand, let's take it even further. If the Catholics are right, then the Protestants are not right. If the Protestants are right, which group of Protestants is right? Which interpretation of the Bible? So what I say, when you talk about arguing in a circle, if I can break any point of that circle, and that's exactly what they did. As I will develop it, they told you the false history of the Shaolin Temple and where Kung Fu originated. The next thing that will happen is what is known as an assertion. A person will simply make a statement. You see it all the time. World champion. Led this particular thing. That. Go right on down the line. Or let me read to you from here, from Taekwondo Times. It's not Taekwondo Times I'm concerned about. It's an ad. At this point, my age will show as I have to put my glasses on. To give you an idea of assertion, something that's so ridiculous, unbelievable,
But a lot of times people believe it. This type of stuff should be right up there in the supermarkets with woman gives birth to an elephant. Dog found on spaceship, right on down the line. 3-year-old girl gives birth to 400-pound baby. From Choi Kwan Do. Grandmaster Kwang Choi, the most highly respected technical authority of all time. First of all, what's a technical authority? What is your basis to say that he is the highest technical authority of all time? The same thing. You'll take something such as People's Magazine. The 10 most beautiful women in the world. By whose standard? The next thing you have to do when you're arguing then is there has to be a definition of terms. What do you mean by beautiful? The 10 greatest movies of all time. Are they taken in consideration? The Japanese, the Chinese market? Okay, so as you get in this, the next thing you'll hear from here is what is known as name calling. The thing that the government used for years, he was a communist. During the MacArthur era, this was classic. He would stand in front of the audience, the Supreme Court even, in front of the Senate, and in this briefcase, I have the names of 89 known communists in our State Department. There were never one person ever proven. Yet people's entire lives would be ruined just by the fact that you call them a name. He's an idiot. He's black. He's a Jew. He's a kike. It has nothing to do with the person's qualifications. And to show you how they use it even today is that in the primary in Louisiana, of course, Duke ran. Everyone knows at one time that he was a Nazi, but it panicked everyone. And that's what they've labeled him, Nazi. And what they did, of course, they brought in as many blacks, justifiably so for registration. And here's what they did. Duke is destroyed in Louisiana. He's a Nazi, but what they didn't tell you, over 50% of the whites voted for him. Remember, we made the same mistake. We laughed at that man with that funny little mustache in Germany. What person in a serious mind would ever take Hitler seriously? The entire Second World War revolved around this. So the same thing, it gets into the martial arts from here. Rather than destroying what a person has to say, from here you name call. Now I want to bring it up to date the same way. Is that certain members in Kempo, of course, in the Tracy system, as most of you, we trace our origin back to James Matosi. Once you have walked down the path that I have walked down to, this, that Ray Aquila, that Bruce Judnick, that different members that studied directly from here with James Matosi, you'll understand why we could not tolerate the final years of Ed Parker's life. Yet those people who came from Parker's system knew that something was brewing. And I'll get into this more, you understand, they knew that they had absolutely no lineage. So what is our classic statement? From here, the new founders who suddenly have declared themselves 8th degree black belts. Huck Planus, James Matosi was unqualified. And in 3 words, James Matosi was unqualified. He is trying to destroy 2,000 years of history that he knew nothing about. And that's what happens. When you get to the point, it's in law. I'll give you an idea. If you have a strong case, argue the facts. If you have a weak case, argue the law. If you have no case, just argue. And that's what's going to happen now to all of those people that can cut themselves off from the Matosi system. James Matosi and the system we have is a noble system. It goes back for 21 generations. And I'll be honest with you. When I started out on this quest of James Matosi, I started with very negative feelings about the man. But in any true research, what you do, you go where the facts take you, not go out and create the facts. And that's exactly what happened. Years ago, I did not realize James Matosi had given us so much information. But I looked at it through my mind. I looked at it strictly from being a Christian, a Mormon to be exact. And when he made certain statements, they didn't register with me. Certain things looked like contradictions. But as I reread the different articles, I found there was a clue. I would buy one book. One book would lead to a second book. A second book would lead to a third book. And suddenly you would understand. And basically, one of the things we'll get into more and more is going to be Zen Buddhism. Right now, there are 84,000 descriptions of what Zen Buddhism is. As I get into it, I will give you a very, very brief layman's. Basically what it is, it's enlightenment. There are three major questions that everyone has, no matter what religion you are. Where did I come from? Who am I? What am I doing here? And where am I going to go after I die? And one of the realms of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, that when you become enlightened, you no longer have the ego I, where you're important. You understand this. And the next thing that is important in Zen Buddhism, they believe in reincarnation and rebirth. It's called karma. The type of life that you live today will determine how you're born. It was the Japanese coming out of the Okinawans that would come from the peasants. But this is another thing that Ed Parker did not want you to know. We have a great tie to the heritage of the Okinawan and Japanese systems. But for you to fully understand why Ed Parker deviated so far, I have to take you back. But remember, I knew an Ed Parker that none of you did. For most of you in the martial arts, this is the only Ed Parker that you ever knew. But I knew an Ed Parker that none of you have ever known. What I want you to understand, I knew an Ed Parker that none of you will ever know. I came up at a time when none of you were there. The pictures you just saw were taken outside of church. This is his family then. Remember, we were all Mormons together. We attended the same ward. We moved, the next classification is a ward. We were always in the same ward that he was buried in. What I'm saying is that being Mormons, Ed Parker and I have been in places that none of you will ever be. We have taken vows. We understand things that none of you will ever understand. I was a part of that. I knew Ed Parker when he was poor, when he drove a 53 Mercury, when he lived in a little two-bedroom apartment. And I watched this man shattered. When he finally earned enough money that he could move out of this apartment into a decent neighborhood. Let's go back, it isn't that long ago. They would not sell him a house in that neighborhood. They didn't want his kind of people living there. As you look back in history, it wasn't that long ago. The Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, 54, when schools in the United States were segregated. People don't seem to realize that during the Korean War, they didn't call them blacks then, there were Negro units. They weren't even fighting with the whites. It would once again be General MacArthur that would combine the units. He said, my only complaint about the Negro soldiers, you don't send me enough of them. They're great fighting men. What it was then, Ed Parker, when I knew him, would relate to me that when he was working at the health clubs and go out with people such as Terry Robinson, he was so poor that at the end of the meal he would be the last one to leave. And then he would take the tip that was left. He needed it to provide food for his family. The Ed Parker that I knew was hungry. He taught all of the lessons. Come here. He was the instructor. The heart of Kempo then was always the self-defense techniques. Kata had very little importance. It will only come later, as I will get into. You see how Kempo was developed. You have to understand then, what makes a person think the way they do, where did their prejudice come from? And you have to understand now, Ed Parker became a very prejudiced man against almost all of the other races, and I'll explain why, the Japanese in particular, the Chinese, and the Koreans. I want you to follow this step by step. All of this is fact. All you have to do is research it. This is the type of information that most of Parker's top people tried to keep from being published. And any time it was, they would jump on the bandwagon. What type of bandwagon? Threats, death threats would be made on the phone. I have audio tapes of this. Other people would leave the organization. Threats were made to them. Let's go back now and start tracing this history. Notice in all of Ed's writing, every book, they never give you the exact dates that Ed Parker actually started studying with Professor Chow, or what periods. What it has over this period of time that he was supposed to be studying with Chow, we also have 4 great gaps. First, where did it start from? Second, he was in the Coast Guard for a period of 4 years. Next, he was at Brigham Young University for 4 years. We know that he started studying with Frank Chow. Actually, there were 3 Chow brothers. Later history will also explain the third forgotten Chow brother that would end up in jiu-jitsu under Okazaki and end up also teaching in California on the Monterey Peninsula. But getting back to this, exactly what periods of time did Ed Parker ever studied with Professor Chow? Search all the records. You will never find the exact date, even the exact date he started or the exact date he stopped. Everything is stated at all the times he was studying for his first degree black belt. Yet at no time, any record, does Ed Parker ever state, has ever been written, he received a black belt on such and such a date from Professor Chow. And no one has ever seen a diploma for that first degree black belt. And more than that, in the first black belt issue, the first issue would come out in 1962. Ed Parker would be featured in this first issue, given several pages under Ed Parker, the Black Belted Mormon. In that same issue of Black Belt magazine, on page 4, he would represent himself as a third-degree black belt or Sandan. This would where the problems would really start. Not only is there no record of a first degree, nor is there a record of a second degree, there's no record of a third degree. He would then later on be challenged to produce this, which I'll get into in a moment. But this is where the friction with the Japanese would start. The owners of Black Belt magazine were 2 Japanese brothers. But more than this, the rumors were now pretty persistent. Ed Parker was only a green belt. He was only a brown. These rumors would fly with him the rest of his life. Somewhere's in between there is truth. But let's go back then. What happened at this particular point then? Ed Parker wanted to sell Black Belt magazine in his own school. They would not allow him unless he could produce a diploma showing his rank. And he could not. He was laughed at and humiliated by the entire martial arts community. As fate would have it, or you want to call it karma, would never be too kind to Ed, that he would compound the mistakes. Once again, as fate would have it then, when Ed Parker opened his first commercial karate school in Pasadena, At that particular point, there was only, theoretically, one other school that had opened before him. That was in 1947 with Robert Tracy. He was in Arizona. But when Ed opened his karate school in 1956 and 1957, there were only 2 karate schools in the entire United States, and wouldn't you know it, they would both be in Los Angeles. And worse than that, the person involved, Mr. Oshima, would have his main branch out of UCLA, and then they would have a branch out of Caltech. Caltech is also located in Pasadena, California. So ironically, 2 karate schools in the United States, only a few blocks apart. Not only was Mr. Oshima, a representative from Japan, is one of the finest martial arts of all times. As a matter of fact, he would be the one who would, in conjunction with Master Funakoshi, put out the master text and do all of the original katas of the Shotokan system. When people ask me what one man in the world exemplifies most the true spirit of karate and Bushido, I never hesitate. The man you're looking at, Master Oshima, is the one that represents this. After he'd been in the United States for about 3 years and his education and training were completed, he would then rotate back to his native Japan. And since he'd already established the Shotokan clubs of the United States, he would then be replaced by a man who would be even more famous than he was. That man would be Mr. Nishiyama. Here you're seeing some pictures of an older man. As I get into the second series of tapes, the history of modern Kempo, you will see him as a younger man. As much of a thorn in the side as Master Oshima was, Mr. Nishiyama would be even worse. He would put out the first book, Mr. Nishiyama here, that would revolutionize and become the standard by which all other books tried to emulate. How good was this man? Coming from me, a Kempo stylist, the finest kata I have ever seen in my life was performed by that man at Nisi Week in Los Angeles. Also, this is the man who would teach Bruce Lee how to kick. All of these stories you're going to get in the history of modern Kempo. What it was then, he would present a book that would become a standard. The form was impeccable. This would then later be duplicated by Master Nakayama, and you're going to see excerpts from these books that would never even be tried by Ed Parker. How good were these books? Master Nakayama's book I use as a standard text in a Kempo school because the form is unbelievable. His explanation of how to do basic movements are exactly there from a scientific standpoint. In a few points I may quibble with the application afterwards, but Ed Parker was never able to do this. On the left, you see the classic form, and Mr. Nishiyama is a young man. And on the right is Mr. Okazaki. This is the finest kicker I have ever seen in my life. He would also end up being one of our competitors in Philadelphia. What I'm talking about, all of these men you see I knew personally. They are a part not only of the history of Kempo, but of the development of the martial arts in the United States. Look at the unbelievable form of those two men. Here again, you see the same form of those two men. This time it's reversed.
Mr. Okazaki is on the left, and Mr. Nishiyama is on the right. The pictures you're looking at are from Master Nakayama's, the head of the Shotokan system, his dynamic karate. These are on the walls of every studio I've ever had since this book came out. Look at the unbelievable form. When you want to demonstrate or talk about a front thrust kick, I can talk all day long. All you have to do is take one look at those pictures to see the unbelievable power. If you can see it up close, they're not even talking about power, they're talking about balance. Notice the projection of the hip forward. Notice the center of gravity. Notice the muscles, the tensions of the leg. The straight force driving out, ending up at the ball of the foot. A perfect example of what a thrust kick should be. It's much easier for me simply to walk up with one of my students, this is what a front thrust kick looks like. I have never seen in any book, in any sport, anything that more exemplifies raw, explosive power that does something. This would continuously be brought up to Ed Parker, and he was always promising, oh, wait till you see my next book, I'll knock their socks out. And all we got was another book full of line drawings. Nothing. We kept waiting for the definitive Encyclopedia of Kempo. Ed Parker was never able to match this at any level. It would seem that the Japanese had the perfect combination, but no, you cannot serve two masters. Remember, it was Mr. Oshima who had first developed the club in the United States. It would then be taken over from here by Nishiyama. As fate would have it, of course, Mr. Oshima would return to the United States. And this would cause a division and a split in loyalties between the two camps that would forever destroy the power of the Japanese martial arts in the United States. Going back to that period of time, 64, 65, the Koreans were unheard of. We were just starting to move. Parker was unorganized. If the Japanese, rather than fighting among themselves, had united, they would have been in position that Taekwondo is today. And they would have been in position, being united, to try to get karate in the Olympics. To properly understand the heritage of James Matosi, what was the original Kempo, you have to understand what was added. Where did all of these changes come about that Ed Parker would put into effect? The pivot year would be 1959. In 1959, for the first time in 5 years, Ed Parker would return to the Hawaiian Islands. Told everyone it was to go over there and bring Chow back to the United States. No. Chow had never intended to come back to the United States with Ed Parker. It boiled down to two things. First of all, Ed Parker wanted more rank, and Chow wanted money. Neither got what they wanted. So that particular point, Ed Parker came back to the United States having the same rank he had always had. What it is now, at this particular point, as I point out, he's already having a problem with the Japanese. What is going to happen at this point then, Parker decides to establish credibility, he has to put out a book. So he'll put out his first book, Kempo Karate, which will be put out by Iron Man Industries. It's a basic text. You'll look at it, he had nothing else to reference to, so basically it was patterned after James Matosi's book with a heavy emphasis upon self-defense techniques laid out in exactly the same manner. Okay, this is now, as I want to point out, subtly over a period of time, Kempo was changed and lie after lie was made. What I'm going to do then is present the exact facts so you can see what I'm talking about. First of all, let's take the famous karate creed. I come to you with only karate, empty hands. I have no weapons. But should I be forced to defend myself, my principles or my honor, should it be a matter of life or death, of right or wrong, then here are my weapons. Karate, my empty hands. That creed would be created and written by this student, a Japanese student of Ed Parker's by the name of Ben Otaki, who is the original person who did all the photography for Ed Parker. Ben Otaki would become quite disillusioned as he saw the great amount of prejudice against the Japanese. For this reason, he would then join the Japanese community, cut himself off from Ed Parker completely, and at the present time, he's now with Tak Kubota. He publicly came out in an article and stated, and we all knew it, he was the one who actually authored this. Notice also as I get into it, it is empty hands, and I'll make the distinction as you get into it. We do not teach empty hands. This is what Ed Parker was fighting about all of the time. The distinction will be made between tong hands, this is original, and empty hands. Once again then, this man never got the credit for what was known as the Karate Creed. This would be just the beginning. In the last few years of Ed Parker's life, he realized that there were so many inconsistencies and lies that sooner or later would come out. And what he did then systematically, he took many members of his own organization and simply got rid of them. Larry Tatum should have been the next person that would follow in line. What would happen then? He realized the greatest source of information out there came from myself. Therefore, he decided what he had to do. He could not refute the evidence that I'm going to present, so what he had to do is try to destroy my reputation. So the first thing that he would state from here, and this is after having been with him for 30 years, he was only a brown belt. And this is something, a lie that has been carried on now by the complete organization and even Mrs. Parker as of last night. One of our people would call up, tell him that the person was with Tracy, and says, "Oh, you can't believe anything that he says. He's only a brown belt." The same thing would be true of people who came directly up under our organization and saw our black belt diplomas. Okay, what I'm going to do at this particular point then is to show you the exact quotes from Ed Parker, from Karate International. Then I am going to present all of my diplomas. I'm going to present the black belt tree from Ed Parker's own book himself. And then for the first time, you're going to find out where Ed Parker got his black belts. The first thing I'm going to present to you, so you can see, is my first black belt diploma awarded to me by Ed Parker. As a matter of fact, later on I will show you, my brother and I were actually, from here, the 4th and the 5th black belts he'd ever given out. Later on I will show you the pictures of the first degree, first black belt, the second black belt, the third black belt. We're all to leave Ed Parker. Notice the diploma, Al Tracy, Shodan, the 7th day of January, 1962, under Ed Parker's signature. What you're looking at is a copy of my 3rd degree, my Sandan, also awarded by Ed Parker. What I'm going to do, I'll be coming back to this in the family tree in a moment. What I want to explain at this particular point then, where did Ed Parker get his rank? Pointed out, you will see that Parker's lack of rank became a very, very sore point with him, especially in relation to the rest of the martial arts community. So as such, that In 1965, in preparation for the international tournament, myself, my brother Jim, Mills Crenshaw, Tom Connor, all got together with Ed Parker in a hotel room, and we are the ones that promoted Ed Parker to 7th degree black belt. Up to this point, notice, he had been claiming 3rd degree, as I pointed out in black belt magazines. In a minute, I'll show you other publications where he simply stated himself as a high-ranking black belt. At that particular point then, since I was a senior member, remember, we were really the only organization that existed with Parker, 64 and 65. Since I was a senior ranking member and the highest member in the organization next to Ed, I was personally then, from here, offered 5th degree black belt. All of these people are witnesses. Rank meant absolutely nothing because we knew where it came from. So at this particular point, I simply had a 3rd degree awarded to me like everyone else. You'll notice now that I stated this happened in 1965. Tom Connor, who was with us now, had no rank whatsoever. Therefore, to make his rank more legitimate, he prevailed upon Ed Parker then to backdate all diplomas one more year to 1964. Okay, so at this particular point then, not only did we have those 4 people, myself, my brother Tom Connor and Mills Crenshaw, but Tom Connor's wife Charlotte would also sign all of those diplomas. So you notice at this particular meeting, there were 5 of us. From this point on then, Ed would start using this as his rank. The next time Ed Parker was promoted, it was also, by the same committee, it would also then include Sterling Peacock. When we promoted him to 8th degree black belt, we also awarded him a plaque to go along with it. Okay, what I want to do now is to forget everything I've told you. All of this can be verified. Most of us are still alive that were there. Let's go to the family tree that appeared in Ed Parker's own publication, the first of his set Infinite Insights into Kempo. From Ed Parker's own book, this is my own personal ragged copy, but you can get your own. It's simply the first book in this series, Infinite Insights into Kempo, number 1, Mental Stimulation. It has the complete chart of black belts. What I'm going to do now is give you close-ups of each of these individual sections. Notice from the family tree, Ed Parker's Kempo family tree of black belts only. On the same chart, under special notice, since it's small, I want you to take particular attention now to the 3rd paragraph, and I quote directly from Ed Parker's chart. All names on the chart have been recognized, approved, and are adopted by the IKK Board of Directors as black belts. Okay, the IKK Board of Directors, however, does not acknowledge the high ranks that are claimed by some of the black belts on the list. Notice though, this is the official black belt list of Ed Parker's black belt in the Kempo system as approved by the IKKA. What I'm going to do at this point now is to show you my list of black belts. I submitted a complete list of over 200 black belts, but of this, either through neglect or knows what, only 70 would make the chart. But when you see it, you find out that we have the largest collection of black belts of any of Parker's students. Notice that listed under Al and Jim Tracy. First of all, we are black belts. There are also now listed our black belts. In this particular case, I'm going to show you in a moment. Notice that I have put a circle around one of those. This will become critical in a moment when I start talking about Huck Planus,
would also, at the end of Parker's death, become disenchanted. The IKK would go out and form their own organization. He will verify the fact that I'm telling you this material was simply made up step by step. What I want to do at this point, put things in perspective about how far I went back. Notice at this period of time now that Ed Parker has listed us on the black belt tree, and notice that one of my black belts from here is a man by the name of Steve Labonte. Steve Labonte was with me for about 4 or 5 years before he would also study under Ed Parker. The person that we're talking about now is Huck Plantis, who would later on become one of the top people in Ed Parker's organization. Remember now, I go back to 1957. This was put out in 1981. Huck Plantis would then come in. Notice the relationship. This is Steve Labonte, his first instructor. Let's see where Huck Plantis is now listed on the family tree. You'll notice that as of 1982, this is when Ed Parker put out this chart, that Richard Huck Plantis is a very, very small player. Notice at this particular point, he comes several years after myself. He comes after Steve Labonte. But he will point out to you, and I'm going to quote you, show you the exact magazines, that by the end of the 60s, he, Tom Kelly, Ed Parker, would simply sit down, make up the techniques, and as Huck would point out, he made up most of those techniques himself and would make up the original terminology. The following quotes you're going to get are from an interview with Huck Plantis in Black Belt magazine of January 1992. What I'm trying to point out, these words do not come from myself. They come from the people who are close to Ed Parker. They saw all these things were happening. They knew where the manuals came to. They knew that people were being lied to all along. I'm going to point this out as I take the different quotes. But first of all, let's talk about the manuals. Later on, you'll understand why Parker was insistent upon making completely new manuals after 15 years. Interviewing Huck Plantis. Was anyone else beside yourself and Parker qualified to teach the other instructors? Plantis. Not really, because the material was basically new then. Tom Kelly, Mr. Parker, and I wrote the original manuals back in the late 60s. So no one else at the time had that material. Black belt. So you were one of 2 individuals who together with Parker created the original American Kempo manuals. Notice that up till this point, there was no American Kempo. Later on, you'll understand why it would change to American Kempo. Plantis. A lot of the original terminology in the Kempo system is mine, as well a lot of the technique material. I'm sure a lot of people are going to criticize me for pointing all these things out about Ed Parker. Said, why do you bother? Because myself and other people for the last 2.5 years have continuously been getting death threats. I have an entire recorder full of them. Not just myself, but other people in the organization. Anyone who would oppose Ed Parker and get into it would be muscled. Death threats would be made. People would be pushed to a certain limit. It's also very obvious that someone was pushed too far by Ed Parker and his group in Pasadena, and someone would torch his studio. You don't torch the studio of a beloved man. Okay, it makes more sense. I've been telling people this for years before Ed Parker died. These people would sit around and they think it would not happen to them. Let me quote once again now. You can see here from Huck Plantis, from Black Belt magazine. Following Parker's death, a lot of changes took place in the IKK that had caused division in the Kempo community. What happened to cause longtime IKK members like yourselves to become dissatisfied? Remember now, Huck has been watching this going on for years and didn't realize that he was one of these people. I did. Plantis, it's all about power struggles and wannabes. Everyone wanted to be Mr. Parker's right-hand man. He told many people things that led them to believe they were going to be put in certain positions or given certain roles within the organization. He often told people what they wanted to hear and led people to believe he was teaching them when he really wasn't. I would hear how certain people claimed to have taken private lessons with Mr. Parker for years. So I would watch them and think to myself that if they had been given privates, they weren't learning anything. I would talk to the old man about these people, and he would tell me what was really going on. There were lots of people Parker didn't want to teach and didn't teach, although they thought they were being taught by him. Basically, he would give them the runaround. That's exactly what I've been telling people for years, that the system called American Kempo's development was not a brilliant product from here. People were simply jacked around by Ed Parker, used, as Huck Planus will point out. He watched all of these people. But what I could see from the outside, and I talked to Ed, the same thing was happening to Huck Planus. And of all the people, are certain ones that really got screwed over. Huck Planus was right up the top from there. He deserved better than this. Ed Parker would take the cream of the crop. Then the only person with real ability to go out and teach the katas would be Huck Planus. Ed Parker was incapable of this. The next man that really should have taken over the organization here was Frank Trujillo. He had the physical makeup, he had the temperament of it, but he could not be controlled by Mrs. Parker. And like I pointed out, just last night, one of our people, once again, Mrs. Parker, is coming up with the same old line. You can't believe Al Tracy. He's only a brown belt. No wonder then, and this term does not come from me whatsoever, from within her own organization. You can see where she's destroying it. Her own people behind her back call her the Dragon Lady. Huck Planus, further down in the interview, would continue the same line. Black belt. Did you feel that Parker named you the IK's executive vice president because he felt you had more, was his most knowledgeable assistant? Planus. There were probably several reasons why the old man, Parker, chose me. He used to get mad at me for teaching too much and for teaching some people material he didn't want them to know. After that, when I did a seminar, I would clear it with the old man what he did and did not want me to teach. There was a lot of material. I don't know why he didn't want covered by certain people. The reason why he selectively taught this way we'll probably never know. I will tell you in the future. What it boils down to, not only was the original system that Chow had taught, came through Parker, through Mendoza, by this period in history, it no longer resembled James Potosi, the original system that Chow had taught. What I'm going to do now is to go back and show you that whenever Ed Parker wanted to, it wasn't just a matter of misrepresentation. He would out and out lie. Like Huck Planus pointed out, he jerked everyone around when it came to teaching. In all honesty, he taught very few people. Whenever Mr. Ed Parker decided to tell a lie, who was to refute him? Let's take a classic example from here. This is from the De Pasquale's magazine, talking about James Potosi. This is from Ed Parker, that one of the prison guards that gave him records, the rap sheets showing that Potosi was arrested in 1935, get this, 1935, for rape and extortion. Let's look at the facts. Let's assume this was even true. Let's assume this was even true. Notice he said he was arrested but not convicted. But watch, it's an out and out lie. Let me show you why. From James Potosi's book, In Search of Kempo. From James Potosi's own book, his history. I began studying Kempo at the age of 5, and at 14 became the successor. My formative years were spent in Japan, but in 1937 I returned to Hawaii, the place and country of my birth. 1937. He wasn't even in Hawaii in 1935.
would be 2 years before he came back. What I want to point out is that every step of the process of building Ed Parker, building American Kempo, is either misrepresentation, out and out lies, or complete misstatements. From Infinite Insights into Kempo, Volume 1. He also graduated from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, where he obtained a BS degree in sociology and psychology. Ed Parker had only a single degree. That was in sociology, which appeared in all of the early writings. But notice as time went on, they simply rewrote history. Continuing on, in the same book, another complete misrepresentation. Remember, myself, my brothers were also Korean veterans. Anyone in the military will understand what I'm talking about. I was drafted into the Korean War in 1951, managed to be stationed in Hawaii for 2.5 years of my 3-year hitch with the U.S. Coast Guard. You don't get drafted into the Coast Guard. You enlist and volunteer. When you get drafted, you go into the Army, and during the Korean War, when you got drafted in the Army, you went to Korea and got shot. That's why most of us, the same thing, Ed would enlist into the Coast Guard. I would enlist to the Air Force. I spent my military duty, where it sure beat being out there on the rice paddies of Korea. Once again, another misrepresentation. What I want to point out, these are only isolated instances. I go through the entire book. But now I'm going to take a classic example, how the people in the organization, years after the fact, simply sat around and recreated this mysticism to give something to a system called American Kempo that had nothing to do with it, that completely lost the tradition of that taught by Matosi and Chow. This is, of course, the famous Kempo crest that Ed Parker would have everyone believe that he and his brother designed. No. I can simply tell you no, and it doesn't mean anything until I tell you the story behind the person who actually developed and created this. This was a fellow student that I trained with at Ed Parker's in the latter part of the 1950s. His name was Dick Tracy, a very gifted artist. I want you to take a look at this design. I want you to look at everything else that ever appears in any of Ed Parker's books. Nothing matches this quality and style. Every artist has his own signature. Look at this, compare it with anything else. He was a very gifted and very talented student here, studied at the same time. He would also hand make Ed Parker a custom knife out of simply a file. As fate would have it, and you'll meet Jimmy Woo in a while, Dick Tracy then, after having designed this, given it to Ed, would then go in with Jimmy Woo. And here they would start working on very weird things. Let me give you the classic example so you'll understand. What they did, using the Chinese method, they would walk a plank. They would walk a plank blindfolded. They would walk a plank with their hands tied behind them. Here's why Dick Tracy is not around to contest this patch. One night, he got fully unclothed, turned off the lights, blindfolded himself, put a noose around his neck, with his hands tied behind him, would then walk the plank without being able to see. The next morning, his parents found him hanged to death where he had fallen. When you see this patch then, you understand why Dick Tracy is not there to contest it. What I want you to understand now, late 1950s, I'm going to take from Ed Parker's book written in 1981 and show you how they went back and simply created history, that all these symbolisms and meanings of the patch were absolutely false and a lie. Let's take it step by step. What you're looking at is a brochure that
that would be used not only by Ed Parker but ourselves. What people seem to forget that one period of history, there was only one organization from here, and we were Ed Parker's top representatives, which you'll see in a moment. This particular brochure was used during the periods of 1962, 1963. And what I want you to notice at this particular point now, that patch we're talking about appears. That patch has been in existence for 5 years. Notice now how we slowly build the deception and lies about this patch. Notice in those days, it was one big happy family. Kempo Karate. These are studios in the Bay Area. We had one in San Francisco, you know, this time Sacramento, and that's a picture of Ed Parker as a very young man. Notice when we're talking about this, the founder, Ed Parker, a high-ranking black belt. Notice no rank is mentioned. Notice this how this will build now. At this particular point, in 1962, he had declared himself a third-degree black belt in Black Belt magazine. He had been called down for this. So notice at this particular point, he was now afraid to put it in print again. This is in the same period of time. It won't be until 1965 that once again, myself, my brother, Mills Crenshaw, and Tom Connor will promote him to 7th degree black belt. This brochure contains quite a bit of history. I'll take it picture by picture. Some of the people won't mean anything to you, a lot of old timers that will. Notice once again in the corner is the patch, and on it is the creed. Notice at this particular point, Ed Parker is not taking credit for that creed, because this is simply the early 60s. Everyone has been around, all of us know who Ben Otaki is. So there's no way at this particular point in history Ed can claim that he was the one who invented this creed. How time ages us all. Notice the person in there, slim, crew cut, wearing a patch. That is me in Ed Parker's brochure as a 1st degree black belt. These pictures to your old timers will also be of significance. One of the toughest fighters to the left is Leonard Mao. And the person circling to the far side is Chuck Sullivan. And Chuck Sullivan's signature will appear on my 3rd degree black belt diploma. This person that you're seeing, of course, is a young brown belt at the time. Studied under myself with Ed Parker. Man, become a legend, go with Bruce Lee. This is Danny Ansanos. We all came out of that period of history. We all know what was happening. I now want you to notice on the same brochure, I'm called Grading the Belt System. Going down where I've highlighted it. The colors of the belts consist of white for beginners, brown more advanced, black. What I want to point out at this point, 61, 62, there were no colored belts. Yet the patch had now been in existence for almost 5 years. Now, let's go to Ed Parker's book and show you how they rewrite history, give mysticism to all of these colors. They were simply made up. It did not exist. Once again, what I want to emphasize, when this patch was created by Dick Vassell, there were no colored belts. So what does Parker do at this particular point? He then points out the white background is the significance of many beginners who form the base of the art. Look at any patch. The basic background is white. But here, the yellow or orange represent the first level of proficiency, the mechanical stage. Like I pointed out, it wouldn't be until sometime afterward, this period of time, 5 years later, that my brother and I
would invent the colored belt system. The history of Kempo will cover this completely. What I'm pointing out, that the yellow and the orange had absolutely no representation to any belts because these colors did not exist. He then points out the brown in the eye of the tiger. In the original, there wasn't any. Then he goes on to point out the red is professorship. The term professorship and things like that would be invented by Mills Crenshaw, that entire terminology, 15 years after this patch was made. What I'm going to do now is to take only 4 or 5 of the more significant things and tell you how it does not correlate. It was simply made up to give mysticism to an otherwise just fantastic design. The 6th now will involve 2 things on there, the circle and the different directions. Look at the interpretation. Of course, the circle is a circle is a circle. Yet he would make the statement, all moves evolve from a circle, whether they are defensive or offensive. Yet you look below it, you see all of those straight lines. This history will go on. You will find out when Dutmar Buddhidurahama came from India. He never taught anyone the martial arts. He had only one disciple. It was strictly Zen. Yet they would have us believe not only did he teach that, he taught them katas and sets. What Parker did then, mysteriously, he was able to show you what those hand movements were. First of all, there weren't any hand movements. But then he would tell you that the indications from here, that the 8 lines represent the 18 hand movements. Count them any way you want. There's 8, double them to 16. There is no way out of that basic movement that any of those things add up to here to 18. But more than that, what you see on a patch is a symbol that Tracy's has used for time immemorial. It starts with our orange belt. That is attacking circle. Take a look at the first arrow straight up. 12 o'clock, 1:30, 3, 4:30, 6, 7:30, 9, 10:30, and back to 12. Years ago, when Dick Tressell was part of this, we were starting to write down the different self-defense techniques, trying to figure out different directions. Since my brothers and I were interested in flying, to us it was quite simple to use the compass. Every airport in the world is laid out. 18, 36, 27, you know that's the direction of the compass, but most people could not. So what was done at this particular point, we looked into actual applications of fighting. Of course, the typical was an aircraft. Life and death, you have to be able to instantly tell your wingman or someone else to pilot, where is the enemy? Bandit, 12 o'clock high. That told you immediately that the enemy was straight in front of you and he was high. The same thing, bandit, 6 o'clock low. Bandit, 9 o'clock high. That's exactly what it was. It was instant recognition. So you take a look at that. Count it any way you want. You're not going to come up with 18 hands. There were no 18 hands. The next is an area where Parker would blow it continuously, and because of it, he would be continuously ridiculed by the Orientals for using the Japanese kanji or the Chinese characters and not knowing what they meant and put it out. His first book, Kempo Karate, The Law of the Fist and the Empty Hand. On the one side, we have the spirit of the tiger and the dragon. Then on the other side, unless you understood it, Parker would have you believe this meant the law of the fist and the empty hand. Remember, we do not teach karate. This is where then the main deviation will start to come as we get into the true origin of Kempo, the heritage of James Matosi. Of all the major martial arts, the history of Kempo is the least understood. And it starts from the very inception of its name. Despite the fact that it had its origin in China, from here, it would be introduced by the Matosi family, and since Matosis were obviously Japanese, they would use then the Japanese language rather than the Chinese. Something that must be understood. In the history of Japan, they never had a written language. Therefore, the Chinese characters would be introduced to Japan, and as such, they would then take their words and match them up to the written characters. Also, it should be pointed out that the Chinese, because of the complexity of the writing, all of the sentences, all of their structure was very concise and very short. Since the Japanese did not have a written language, they didn't have to worry about it. Their sentences were long, structured improperly. The greatest problem we have then are the characters that you're seeing on the screen at this particular point. Okay. Remember now, when the Chinese write them, they're called Chinese characters. When the Japanese write them, they're written the same way, but they are called kanji. The Chinese then take a look at these characters, and they pronounce both of these characters Chuan Fa. If there's any doubt about it, remember Tai Chi Chuan here, which means fist law. The top character that you're looking at in Chinese is pronounced Chuan. Later on, you will see this character in here means hand. The covering of the hand is fist. Chuan Fa, fist law. The Japanese look at these same characters and pronounce them Kenpo. Notice, fist law. Notice that I've spelled it both ways. Technically, it should have always been spelled with an M from here. It was only through a mistake that was made, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, that it became known as Kempo. Fortunately for us, whenever you see it spelled with a Kenpo, you know that that is a heritage that comes from James Matosi. Once again then, the Japanese pronounce these two characters, remember they call them kanji in Japanese from here. Ken means fist, po, law, fist law. The Chinese, once again, chua, fan, fist law. The Japanese, Kempo, fist law. At this point, I have to give you a little bit of history. As you get into the religious sects, particularly Zen Buddhism, a person will have, first of all, their given name. In this particular case, James Matosi's given name was James Matosi. His Buddhist name, notice that technically the Japanese never use hyphens, but I've used a hyphen on this top one from here. So you can see Kempo Sai Kosho was a complete name. The way it's actually spelled, they all run together from here. What happened then is that when James Matosi submitted his book to his editors, they saw the spelling of his name, Kenpo, and despite the others that had been written with an M, they made the assumption it should have been spelled Kenpo. And because of this mistake in the entire book then, the editors put in a word N rather than M. But say, fortunately for us, then he did. It was this set of characters that Ed Parker would continuously mistranslate in both his first book and the diplomas. And it would be continuously ridiculed by the Japanese and the Chinese because of this. The characters you're looking at from here are the characters for the Chinese Tang Dynasty. Also of a great deal of confusion, notice it's spelled T, the accent more, T-A-N-G. Normally you'd think it'd be Tang. Remember, Tang is a breakfast drink. It's pronounced Tong, T-O-N-G, from the Tang Dynasty. The Koreans also took a great influence upon this, and they would call their original martial arts from there Tong Sudo. So what it is, when you see this reference, the Tang Dynasty was a period in which China reached its highest degree of glory. And it's during this period of time that the Japanese would come under it culturally from here. As they pointed out, at this period of time, Japan would actually become a stepchild as far as the culture. They would take everything they could from the Tang Dynasty. When the Tang Dynasty would come to an end, for almost 300 years, they would cut off any contact with China. So what it was that the
Chinese and of course the Okinawans who were controlled by them always related back to anything that was Chinese. And this is why when we get into the martial arts, they would use from here to describe the martial arts, Tong. These are the characters then that would be used to describe the martial arts that came over from China originally to Okinawa. They would then become Tong, or representing China, and this is the character for hand. So what this became, the hands of China, or China hands. Later on, these characters would then be combined with the Okinawa martial arts, Okinawa Te, Bushuto Te, to the point, and justifiably so, that by the mid-20s, from here, 1936, that the characters representing China and hand were no longer true, that the martial arts now practiced in Okinawa had a character of their own. Master Funakoshi, who would be the first to really introduce karate to Japan, that made the suggestion that since the martial arts no longer were truly Chinese in character, that the character for the Tong or China should be changed to the Japanese character here for empty, so it would become empty hand. There was a great deal of resentment to this. Finally, the top masters of Japan got together, and by 1936 then, it was officially changed so that the characters used to describe the martial arts then became empty hand. The problem you have, and this is where Ed got into too much problems, is that these characters are pronounced karate, and they mean empty hand. Fortunately, these characters are also pronounced karate, but they mean tong hands. The same thing exists in the English language. We have the word TWO, which means an object to, also TOO, which means also, and to. So what we had here then is that on our diplomas we have the characters of Kempo and China hand that Ed Parker would continue to translate as empty hand, where in fact these are the characters that would have been necessary to have empty hand. So as you look at our diplomas and at Ed Parker's first book, he pronounced it then the law of the fist and the empty hand, but he did not have the characters for empty hand. He had the characters for Tong, China hand. And this would continue to exist even in the book that he published in 1982.